The Intruder's Game. I'm a college student, and like most people my age, I needed a cheap place to live while I finished up my degree. I ended up finding a small off-campus apartment that was perfect for my budget. Tiny, old, but manageable. The building had creaky floors and thin walls, but I didn't mind. I could hear my neighbors sometimes, but I figured it was normal for an older place. At first, it seemed fine. The apartment was cozy, and I finally had some peace and quiet to focus on my studies. But after a couple of weeks, strange things started happening. I would come home and find items slightly out of place, like my keys on the kitchen counter when I could have sworn I left them by the door. There was also a weird smell that came and went, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't overwhelming, just odd. At night, I'd hear strange noises, but I brushed them off as the sounds of an old building. Things creaked and groaned. I told myself it was nothing. Then, one night, I heard a strange shuffling noise, almost like footsteps. It was subtle, but enough to keep me awake. I figured it was the people upstairs moving around, but something about it unsettled me. A few nights later, I was woken up by a loud thud. It wasn't the usual creaks. It was heavier, like someone was walking around. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself it was the neighbors or something falling in the hallway. But it felt different this time. The sound was too deliberate. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My front door was slightly open. I always lock it, and I was sure I had locked it the night before. Panic set in, and I started questioning everything. Was someone in my apartment while I was asleep? From that moment, I became paranoid. I double-checked the locks every time I left the apartment and even started barricading the door at night. But the noises continued, getting louder, and I could swear I felt someone watching me. Every creak made my heart race. I was terrified, but I had no proof that anything was wrong. One night, after hearing the noises again, I decided to install a small door alarm. It was a simple, cheap device, but it gave me some peace of mind. I went to bed, hoping it would help me sleep better. But the very next night, the alarm went off in the middle of the night. I shot out of bed, my heart pounding, as I realized someone had tried to open the door. At this point, I was a mess. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment anymore. Desperate to figure out what was going on, I started checking every inch of the place. That's when I found the small hatch in the ceiling of the hallway. I had seen it before, but never really thought much of it. Now, it terrified me. Could someone be using that to get into my apartment? The fear was overwhelming. Every noise sent me into a panic. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shuffle. I told a friend about it, hoping they would reassure me that I was overreacting. They suggested I call the landlord and have them check the crawl space above the apartment, but I was too scared to confront the situation. What if someone really was up there? Then one night, as I lay in bed trying to calm myself down, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the hatch creaking open. My heart stopped. I froze, listening as I heard soft footsteps, as if someone was climbing down into the hallway. The sound was faint but deliberate. I grabbed my phone and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I texted my friend, telling them someone was in the apartment. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I was too scared to move. I sat in silence, my ear pressed against the door, waiting for any sound. Minutes passed. It was so quiet, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But when I finally gathered the courage to open the bathroom door, I saw it. The hatch was wide open, and a small ladder was still propped up against the wall. My blood ran cold. Someone had been living up there, in the crawl space, sneaking into my apartment while I slept or wasn't home. I felt sick thinking about how long this had been going on. How many times had they come in while I was just lying in bed, oblivious to what was happening above me? The next day, I called the landlord and had the locks changed. I didn't care about the cost, I just needed to feel safe. I made plans to move out as soon as possible, but the unease didn't go away. Even after the locks were changed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. Every creak, every shadow set me on edge. I started sleeping with the lights on, afraid to close my eyes in the dark. I told myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't escape the thought that someone could still be in the crawl space, waiting for me to let my guard down. Eventually, I moved out of the apartment, but the experience still haunts me. I can't stop wondering how long the intruder had been up there, watching me, sneaking in and out of my home. Even in my new place, I catch myself checking the ceiling, listening for the faintest sound of movement. I wish I could say I'm over it, but the truth is, I'm not. I don't think I ever will be. Some nights, I still hear those faint footsteps in my mind, and I wonder if someone's out there, watching, waiting for another chance. I'm safe now, but I'll never feel truly safe again. The mysterious man at the bus stop. I work the late shift at a small diner in town. It's not the kind of place you'd think anything strange would happen, but after my experience, I'll never look at it the same again. My shift ends around midnight, and since I don't drive, I usually catch the bus home. Well, I used to. The street where the diner is located is quiet at night, almost too quiet. After 10 p.m., there are no buses running, and the streets are pretty much deserted. That's why it felt so odd when I first noticed him, a man standing at the bus stop across the street, staring in my direction. At first, I thought he was just waiting for someone, maybe a ride, but every night for a week, he was there, not talking, not moving, just staring. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. My coworkers didn't seem to care when I brought it up. Maybe he's just waiting for a friend, one of them joked. That didn't sit well with me. Why would someone wait at a bus stop after the buses stopped running? I kept brushing it off, telling myself I was overthinking things, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, after a particularly slow shift, I stayed behind a bit longer, hoping he'd leave. But when I stepped out, he was still there, closer this time. The realization hit me. He wasn't just standing there by chance, he was waiting for something. Or someone. I started to feel paranoid. I told myself it was all in my head, but every time I looked at him, I felt like he was watching me. His eyes never left me, and each night, he seemed to be standing a little closer. By the end of the week, he was standing on the same side of the street as the diner. I felt like he was closing in on me, and I didn't know what to do. I decided to change my routine. I started leaving earlier, hoping to avoid him. I even took different routes home, but it didn't matter. He was still there, every night. His presence became this heavy, oppressive thing in my life. I couldn't concentrate at work, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. One night, I was walking home and noticed him standing right by the corner of the diner. My heart was pounding. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to just walk past him. As I passed, I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't dare look back. Halfway down the street, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around, and he was gone. Panic flooded me. Where did he go? Was he following me? That night, I barricaded myself in my apartment. I couldn't sleep, convinced he knew where I lived. Then, around 2 a.m., there was a knock at my door. My heart nearly stopped. I slowly approached, checking through the peephole, but no one was there. That's when I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. The fear had taken over my life. I had to confront him, figure out who he was and why he was watching me. The next night, I left work as usual, heart racing with anticipation. There he was, standing even closer than before. His hood was up, and I couldn't see his face clearly. I clutched my phone in my hand, ready to call for help. Suddenly, he stepped towards me. Every muscle in my body tensed, and before I knew it, I was running. My adrenaline kicked in, and I sprinted down the street. But then, I heard it. A voice, calling my name. I froze. How did he know my name? I turned slowly, and he was walking towards me, hands up as if to show he wasn't a threat. He reached into his pocket, and I braced myself for the worst. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of me, walking home from work a few nights ago. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "My sister asked me to keep an eye on you. She's worried." I stood there frozen, not understanding what was happening. He explained that his sister, one of the regulars at the diner, had noticed I was walking home alone every night. There had been some recent assaults in the area, and she didn't feel comfortable with me being out there by myself. So, she asked her brother to watch over me, to make sure I was safe. I didn't know what to say. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with confusion and lingering fear. He'd been trying to protect me all this time, but the way he went about it was so strange, so unsettling. I thanked him awkwardly and hurried home, still trying to process everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. The events of the past few weeks played over and over in my mind. Even though he wasn't a threat, I couldn't shake the fear that had built up inside me. I felt stupid for being so scared, but the anxiety wouldn't go away. Now, whenever I leave work, I can't help but check over my shoulder. The bus stop still sends chills down my spine, and I don't think that feeling will ever go away. The man might have been watching me out of concern, but the fear I felt was all too real. And here's the weird thing. I thought I saw another figure at the bus stop last night. Probably nothing, right? But I can't shake the feeling that it might all be starting again. The Vanishing House. I've never been one to believe in ghost stories or haunted houses, but what happened to me and my partner still haunts me to this day. We moved into what seemed like the perfect neighborhood, a quiet suburban street lined with well-kept lawns and friendly neighbors. After years of living in the chaos of the city, it felt like a dream. But almost immediately, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. At first, it was little things, the way the night seemed too quiet, how the neighbors always kept their distance. It wasn't unfriendly, just odd. One day, while talking to an older neighbor, I asked about the history of the area. She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward a house a few blocks away. She didn't say much, just mumbled something about people disappearing and quickly changed the subject. That was the first time I noticed it, the house. It looked like every other home in the neighborhood, but something about it was off. The next time I walked by, I could have sworn the windows had moved. The house seemed to shift slightly, like it was never exactly the same each time I passed. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, but the curiosity gnawed at me. My partner, Jess, wasn't concerned at all. "Old houses have quirks," they said, shrugging it off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I overheard someone mention that the house had been vacant for years, ever since a family mysteriously disappeared. No one knew the details, but the house was avoided by most of the neighbors. Jess and I started walking by it more often, just to see if it really was as strange as I thought. Each time, it looked a little different. Sometimes the lawn seemed bigger, other times the paint seemed fresher. Jess began to notice the oddities too, though they didn't seem as disturbed as I was. One evening, as we walked past it, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The house had moved. It was closer. I could feel it in my gut, though Jess told me I was overthinking it. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had started creeping into my everyday thoughts. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed. I'd find myself walking by it daily, sometimes more than once. I began having nightmares, vivid dreams where the house was growing, looming over me, each time closer than the last. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unable to shake the images from my mind. Things started happening at home too. At first it was small, doors left open that we were sure we'd closed, lights flickering without explanation. Jess insisted it was just the stress of moving to a new place, but I wasn't so sure. One night, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving past the window, but when I rushed outside, no one was there. I decided to confront our neighbors, hoping for some kind of explanation, but when I brought up the house, they just stared at me blankly. "What house?" they'd ask as if they had no idea what I was talking about. The more I pressed, the more uncomfortable they became, until one neighbor straight up told me that the house I was describing didn't exist. But how could that be? Jess and I had walked by it dozens of times. Jess decided to drive over there to prove that I was imagining things, that the house wasn't as strange as I thought. But when we got there, it was gone. An empty lot stood where the house should have been. The grass was overgrown, and there were no signs that a house had ever been there. I felt like I was losing my mind. Jess tried to calm me down, insisting it was just a trick of memory, but I knew what I had seen. Something was very, very wrong. I tried to find proof, old records, photos, anything that could show the house had once stood there. But nothing. No one had any memory of the house or the family that disappeared. Even Jess, who had seen the house with me, began to doubt. They started avoiding the topic altogether, but I couldn't let it go. One night, I woke up with a start. My heart was racing before I even opened my eyes. I could feel something wasn't right. I looked out the window, and there it was, the house. It had moved again, now sitting at the edge of our yard, dark and silent, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I tried to wake Jess, but they wouldn't wake up no matter how hard I shook them. The house was closer now, just sitting there, like it was watching. I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my keys and rushed Jess into the car. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was again. The house. It was farther back down the street, but still there, watching us leave. We moved out of the neighborhood the next week. Jess acted like everything was fine, like we'd left the nightmare behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Even in our new place, I felt watched. Sometimes, late at night, I'd peek out the window and swear I could see it again. Just a dark shape at the end of the street, lurking, waiting. I'm sharing this here because I need to know if anyone else has experienced something like this. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if the house is still following us. But whatever it is, I don't think it's finished with me yet. I recently moved into a small apartment on my own, which has been a nice change after years of living with roommates. The place is nothing fancy, but it's cozy, and I've been slowly furnishing it with secondhand items I found online. My latest purchase was a fridge-freezer combo. It was a steal for the price, though I didn't notice anything off at first, aside from the faint humming sound and the weird, musty smell when I opened it. But there was one thing that stood out. The freezer compartment was locked with a sturdy padlock. I laughed when I saw it, thinking maybe the previous owner had some quirky habit or was trying to prevent someone from stealing their ice cream. It was a bit weird, but not a big deal. I grabbed some bolt cutters and easily snapped the lock open. Inside the freezer, there was nothing, just ice. I shrugged and figured the lock was some kind of joke. The next morning, I got up and went to the kitchen to grab some water. As I walked in, I froze. The freezer door was wide open. At first, I thought I had forgotten to close it properly the night before, but when I got closer, I noticed a trail of water and small chunks of ice scattered across the floor, leading all the way to the front door of my apartment. A chill ran down my spine. It didn't make any sense. Someone, or something, must have opened it. But how? I lived alone, and all the windows and doors were locked. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at me. To calm myself down, I decided to check the security camera I had set up in the living room. It wasn't the best camera, but it gave a good view of the kitchen area where the fridge was. I scrolled through the footage from the night before, and what I saw made my heart stop. At around 3 a.m., the freezer door creaked open on its own, and then, just standing there in front of it, was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the freezer, motionless, for hours. I couldn't see the face clearly. It was just a shadowy figure, blurry on the camera, but it was there. I replayed the footage, hoping I'd somehow miss something, some logical explanation. But no, there it was again, standing, staring, and then gone. Panic set in. How could someone get into my apartment without me hearing? I rushed through the apartment, checking every room, but everything was exactly as I left it. No signs of forced entry, no signs that anyone had been here except me. I shut the freezer, bolted the door, and tried to convince myself it was just some kind of glitch, a trick of the camera. But the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak, every small noise in the apartment made me jump. The paranoia kept building. That night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. I even shoved a chair under the doorknob, just to be sure. I told myself everything was fine, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound. Around 3 a.m., I finally started to drift off, but that's when I heard it. Faint footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up. The footsteps were soft but unmistakable, coming from inside the apartment. I forced myself out of bed and crept toward the kitchen. As I got closer, my worst fear was confirmed. The freezer door was open again, and this time, ice crystals were scattered across the floor, leading to the front door. Then I saw it. The same shadowy figure from the camera. It was standing in front of the door, completely still, as if it had been waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. Frozen in place, I fumbled for my phone, trying to call for help, but I was shaking so much that I dropped it. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. The apartment was silent, the only sound the low hum of the fridge. I knew I wasn't alone. That thing, whatever it was, had been standing in my apartment for hours, and I had no idea how it got in or where it went. I grabbed a bag and decided to leave. But just as I reached for the door handle, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. I didn't even turn around. I ran. I tried to open the door, but my hands were shaking too much. I turned around, expecting to see the figure behind me, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps had stopped. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it all, but the fear lingered. The apartment felt oppressive, the darkness too thick, like something was still lurking just out of sight. I locked myself in my bedroom, too scared to sleep. All I could think about was the footage, the figure standing in front of the freezer for hours. What did it want? Why did it stand there? I never got answers. The next morning, I packed up and moved out. I left the fridge behind. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that freezer is still out there. Maybe it followed me. Last night, I heard footsteps outside my new apartment. I don't know if I'm just paranoid or if it's still watching. The hidden camera. I've been living alone in my apartment for the past 2 years. It's a quiet building in a relatively safe neighborhood, which made me feel secure. I work from home, so most of my days are spent here, with the occasional outing to see friends. My routine has always been simple and predictable. Lock the doors, check the windows before bed, standard precautions. But a few weeks ago, I started noticing small, weird things around the apartment. At first, it was little things. like my keys being in a different spot from where I was sure I'd left them, or a book on my shelf looking slightly askew. I brushed it off as me being forgetful. I figured I was just stressed or not paying enough attention. That changed when I noticed my alarm clock. I always set it the same way, perfectly aligned on my nightstand. One morning, it was turned slightly to the right. It was subtle, but enough to make me pause. I chalked it up to maybe bumping it in my sleep, but something about it didn't sit right with me. One evening, I was sitting on my couch, watching TV. My eyes drifted to the picture frame on the wall above my TV. It was off, tilted slightly to one side. It wasn't like that before. I stood up to fix it, and as I lifted the frame, something caught my eye. In the corner, behind the glass, there was a small hole. My heart started racing. It was barely noticeable, but as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just a hole. There was something inside the frame. I pulled it down, removed the back, and found a tiny camera, carefully hidden. It was angled to face directly at my bed. I froze. Someone had been watching me. Frantic, I started tearing through the apartment. I checked every corner, every item that seemed even slightly out of place. And then I found more. A small camera hidden inside a bookshelf. Another one near the bathroom mirror. They were everywhere, tiny and well hidden. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't understand how long they had been there or who could have done this. I immediately checked all the locks. Everything was secure, just as I had left it. There were no signs of a break-in. Whoever had done this had been inside without me even knowing. My apartment, the one place I thought I was safe, wasn't safe at all. I didn't know what else to do, so I called the police. They came and checked the cameras I'd found. They swept the entire apartment for more but didn't find any new ones. They questioned the landlord, but nothing suspicious came up. There was no evidence of who placed them or when. No signs of forced entry. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whoever did this was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. I canceled plans, stopped going out. At night, I'd lie in bed, wide awake, thinking about all the moments someone had been watching me, sleeping, changing, completely unaware. It was a violation I couldn't escape, not even in my own mind. Days turned into a blur. I became obsessed with checking the apartment over and over again. Even though I'd already found the cameras, I couldn't stop myself from looking, convincing myself there might be more. The thought of someone knowing my every move, having access to my private life, was driving me insane. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I had to move. I started packing my things, determined to leave this nightmare behind. The night before I was supposed to leave, I was lying in bed, restless as usual, when I heard something. It was faint, but unmistakable, a creak coming from the living room. I held my breath, telling myself it was nothing, but then I heard it again, this time closer. Panic set in. I quietly got out of bed and locked my bedroom door. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering that someone was in my apartment. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I sat there, frozen, listening to the soft footsteps moving around my apartment. Every minute felt like an eternity. By the time the police arrived, the footsteps had stopped. They searched the apartment, but just like before, there was no sign of anyone. No forced entry, no evidence. They assured me it must have been my imagination. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew someone had been there. I could feel it. The next day, I left the apartment for good. But even in my new place, the feeling didn't leave me. I kept checking the rooms, searching for cameras, never able to fully relax. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, paranoid that someone was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I told myself it was over, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that whoever had watched me knew me too well. They had access to my life in ways I couldn't even comprehend. The fear followed me everywhere. Then, while unpacking in my new apartment, I saw it. The picture frame on the wall, slightly tilted, just like before. I froze, my mind racing with the same fear I had felt back in that apartment. Was it happening again? Even now, I can't get the thought out of my head. I moved out, but the feeling of being watched has never left me. I check every room, every corner, expecting to find another camera. I wonder if I'll ever truly escape, or if I'll always be looking over my shoulder, never knowing when they'll come back. I've been camping before, but nothing like this. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway with 3 friends, a break from the routine, and a chance to disconnect from everything. We planned this trip for months. We found a spot deep in the woods, far from any towns, the kind of place where there's no signal, and the only noise is from the wind in the trees. We arrived late in the afternoon, and everything seemed perfect at first. We set up our tents while joking around, excited about the days ahead. But as we worked, I noticed something strange. The forest was too quiet. There weren't any birds chirping, no rustling of leaves, just this unsettling stillness. It felt like the trees were watching us, closing in on our little camp. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. But there was a moment when I heard a noise, like a twig snapping in the distance. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I brushed it off, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. That night, though, everything changed. We were sitting around the campfire, telling stories, laughing, and enjoying the isolation. But as the night wore on, the noises from the woods started again. It wasn't constant, just little sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, like something was moving around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. It's just wildlife, they said, trying to reassure me, but I couldn't ignore it. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, and at one point, I thought I saw something. A figure, maybe, just standing there, barely visible in the shadows. But when I looked again, it was gone. Then there was a loud crash. We all froze, staring into the darkness beyond the campfire's light. No one said a word. The silence was suffocating, and that's when I knew. It wasn't just me. They heard it too. We weren't imagining things. Something was out there, watching us. I wanted to leave right then, but the others weren't convinced. They said I was overreacting, that we couldn't pack up and leave over a few strange noises. But as the sounds got louder and closer, they began to panic too. We grabbed our flashlights and decided to check the perimeter of the campsite. What we found made my stomach drop. Footprints. Huge, human-like footprints, circling our camp. They were too big to belong to any of us, and they were spaced too evenly to be from an animal. We stared at them, trying to make sense of it, but there was only one explanation. Someone had been watching us. That's when the fear really set in. We scrambled to pack up our things, but as we did, we heard footsteps. Not ours, someone else's. They were coming closer, crunching through the leaves. We couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable. I've never felt panic like that before. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, and I could barely focus on what I was doing. We were almost ready to run when a figure emerged from the trees. At first, we thought it was whoever had been stalking us. We all froze, too terrified to move. But then he spoke, and I realized it was a park ranger. He approached us calmly, noticing how terrified we were. We didn't say much, just pointed to the footprints and told him about the noises. He listened carefully, then explained that there had been a wildfire nearby, and the local wildlife had been acting strange, displaced from their usual habitat. He told us the noises we'd heard were probably animals, and the footprints, well, they could have been from a large animal too. Something about his explanation didn't sit right with me, though. The footprints seemed too deliberate, too human, but he was calm and confident, and that put the others at ease. We packed up the rest of our things with his help, still jittery but starting to laugh it off. Maybe we were overreacting. Maybe the noises had just been animals. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As we loaded our gear into the car, I glanced back at the woods. The fire, the noises, the footprints. It all felt too real to be dismissed so easily. Just before we left, I noticed something. Another set of footprints leading deeper into the woods. They didn't match the rangers, and they definitely weren't from any of us. But by then, we were already driving away, the woods shrinking behind us. As we drove, I felt this strange mix of relief and dread. We were out, we were safe, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Who or what had really been out there that night? The ranger's explanation made sense, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. Even now, I still wonder if we were truly alone in those woods. Maybe it was just animals, like the ranger said. But part of me can't shake the thought that something else was out there, watching us the whole time. We'll never really know, but I can't help but feel that we got lucky. Too lucky. I never thought much about my routine until everything started falling apart. I live alone in a small apartment in what's considered a safe neighborhood. My life was simple. I woke up at 7 a.m., grabbed a coffee at the corner cafe, and took the same bus to work every day. I like things to be predictable. It felt safe. Lately, though, I noticed strange things. A man from down the hall kept staring at me whenever we passed in the corridor. I brushed it off as nothing. Then there were the footsteps behind me at night, quickening as I reached my apartment door. Again, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was being paranoid. But one day, everything changed. I got home and found a letter in my mailbox. No return address, just my name, written in bold letters on the front. I thought it was a mistake, some kind of prank, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It described my day, down to the smallest details. What time I left for work, the coffee shop I visited, what I ordered, and the route I took home. It wasn't threatening exactly, just watching. At first, I convinced myself it was a prank, maybe a bored neighbor, but the second letter came the next day, and the day after that. Each letter was more detailed than the last, describing everything I did, even the small changes I made. I started to feel like I was being stalked, but there was no one around me, no one I could point to. I tried to change my routine, left for work earlier, went to a different cafe, but the letters kept coming. They knew every adjustment I made. Then I got one with a single sentence: "Stop what you're doing." What was I doing wrong? What was I supposed to stop? The letters didn't explain. I tried to figure it out, but all I could feel was the creeping dread that someone was watching my every move. I started looking around at people on the bus, at work, and even in my own building. Every face seemed like a possible suspect. The breaking point came when I got a letter that mentioned something I did in my apartment. It was small, insignificant. I had been pacing around, talking to myself, going over what little I knew. The letter said, "You talk too much." That meant someone had seen me inside my own home. That's when I went to the police. I showed them the letters, explained everything, but they didn't take it seriously. "No real threats here," they said. "Nothing we can do." I was left alone to deal with it. I changed everything. I stopped going to my usual spots, started taking random routes to work, and even took time off just to break the pattern. It didn't matter. The letters always caught up with me. Every time I thought I had outsmarted whoever was behind them, another letter would arrive, mentioning exactly what I had done to try to shake them off. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. I stopped talking to neighbors, even friends. Anyone could be behind this. My world shrank to my apartment and my fear. I installed extra locks, bought a security camera, but deep down, I knew none of it would help. One morning, I found a letter slipped under my door. No envelope this time, just a single piece of paper. You're running out of time. That was the last straw. I decided to leave. I packed a bag, planning to stay with a friend across town. I needed to get out of that apartment, that city. As I was walking toward the door, there was a loud knock. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze. Another letter was pushed through the mail slot. I don't know how, but it described exactly what I was wearing, what was in my suitcase, even my plan to leave. It felt like they were standing right behind me, watching. I panicked, grabbed my things, and bolted. I didn't stop until I was halfway across the city. I moved out of that apartment the next day, found a new place in a different city, far away from anyone who knew me. For a while, things seemed better. I made sure no one knew my address, told only a few people where I had gone. I started a new routine, quieter this time, more isolated. But the fear never left. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking my phone for any signs of a message, any new letters. Weeks passed, and slowly, I started to feel like maybe I had escaped. I could almost relax. Until the letter came. It was the same as always. No return address, no signature, just a single line. You can't hide from me. That's when I knew. It wasn't over. It would never be over. No matter where I went, whoever was doing this would always find me. I've tried to keep my distance from everyone now, keep myself out of sight, but it doesn't matter. They know where I am. They know everything about me. I'm writing this not because I think it will help, but because I don't know what else to do. Maybe someone out there has gone through the same thing. Maybe someone knows how to stop it, because I don't think I'll ever be able to. The babysitter's final night. I don't really talk about this anymore, but after reading some stories on here, I figured I'd share what happened to me. This was a couple of years ago when I was still in high school. I used to babysit for extra cash, and I had a regular gig with this family in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The parents were nice, and their kid, Max, was an easy 8-year-old who never caused trouble. That night, it started like any other. Max went to bed around 8 p.m. after we watched a movie together. The house was quiet, maybe too quiet, but I didn't think much of it at first. After putting him to bed, I sat on the couch, flipping through channels. The stillness was creeping in, the kind that feels like something's waiting to happen. That's when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Who is this? I thought, but I just ignored it, assuming it was a wrong number. A minute later, it buzzed again. This time, I opened the message. Nice shirt. I froze, glancing down at my plain, oversized sweatshirt. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt too specific to be random. I told myself it was a joke. Maybe one of my friends messing with me. I checked my phone's location settings. Nothing was shared. I should have been relieved, but I wasn't. My heart was starting to race. Before I could think too much, another text popped up. I see you on the couch. That was enough. I got up, locking the front and back doors, checking all the windows. The place was dark except for the soft glow of the TV. I could feel my pulse in my ears, but I tried to keep calm. It was probably just someone trying to mess with me. But then the next message came. You can lock the doors, but it won't help. I'm already inside. Panic hit me like a wave. I grabbed my phone and called Max's parents. No answer. Again, no response. My hands were shaking. The texts kept coming, each one worse than the last. The next one mentioned Max by name. He looks peaceful when he sleeps. I felt sick. How did they know Max? I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find and started walking through the house. Every step felt heavy, every creak in the floorboards making me jump. My mind was racing. Who could it be? A neighbor? Someone who knew the family? I didn't want to check Max's room, but I had to. I crept down the hallway, each step making my skin crawl. I reached Max's door and cracked it open. He was still there, sound asleep. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. Another message came in, right outside his room. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever was texting me, they knew exactly where I was. I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't go through. That's when I noticed the Wi-Fi was down, no signal, completely cut off. I turned off my phone's screen, hoping that maybe the person wouldn't know I'd seen the message. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't make a difference. I had two choices. Either I stay and protect Max, or I try to find a way out. But every time I thought about leaving him alone, the knot in my stomach tightened. I couldn't leave him. As I stood there in the dark hallway, another text came in. This time, it was a location ping. It was showing the source of the texts. The signal was coming from inside the house, from upstairs. I gripped the knife tighter, and before I knew it, my feet were moving toward the staircase. My whole body felt heavy with dread. The stairs creaked as I made my way up, each step feeling like it took hours. I was terrified of what I might find. When I reached the top, I heard something. It was faint, almost like breathing, coming from Max's room. I pushed the door open, slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark except for the little nightlight near the bed. I rushed over, but Max wasn't there. The bed was empty. My stomach dropped. I spun around, searching for him. That's when I saw the closet door. It was slightly open, and that faint breathing was coming from inside. I moved toward the closet, every muscle in my body tense. I yanked it open, my heart in my throat. Max was inside, curled up, barely breathing. He was alive, but something was wrong. His breathing was shallow and his skin was clammy. I tried to wake him, shaking him gently. He stirred a little, but it was clear he wasn't okay. I pulled him out of the closet, cradling him in my arms as I ran downstairs. The house was so quiet, it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I tried the front door, but it wouldn't budge, locked from the outside. My phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look, but I had to. The message was simple. It's already too late. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I managed to break a window and get us out. By the time help arrived, the person was gone. Max was rushed to the hospital. He survived, but we never found out who it was. The texts never stopped. I changed my number, but they kept coming. Always from a new number. I never babysat again after that. I still have nightmares about that night. And sometimes, just sometimes, I still get those texts. The van with no license plate. I guess I'm here because I don't know what else to do. Maybe someone can give me advice or at least tell me I'm not crazy. This started a few weeks ago, and it's been getting worse. Now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched all the time. I live in the city and work late shifts at a small office. Every night, I walk home around the same time, taking the same route. It's not a bad area, but it's quiet at night, which makes everything feel a bit more eerie. My life's pretty routine. Work, walk home, sleep, repeat. I don't socialize much, and I'm always tired from work, so I've just gotten used to the monotony. But lately, things have felt off. I've had this weird feeling, like someone's eyes are on me. I figured it was just stress or exhaustion, so I brushed it off. The first time I noticed the van, I didn't think much of it. It was parked across from my office. An old beat-up thing, the kind that looks like it's been through decades of hard use. Nothing unusual in a city, but when I walked past it, I realized something weird. It didn't have a license plate, not in the front, not in the back. That's what stuck with me, but I kept walking, telling myself it was probably nothing. A week later, I was heading home. And that's when I saw it again. I turned down my usual street and there it was, crawling behind me. My stomach dropped. It was the same van, no license plate. I sped up, trying to keep my cool, and it eventually turned down another street. I tried to forget about it, but the next morning, there it was again, parked outside my office. It was too much of a coincidence now. Every day since then, I've seen that van. It's always somewhere near, outside my office, on my street, even near the grocery store. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started changing my routine, hoping it was just in my head. I took different streets, left the office at different times, even took public transport a couple of times. But the van kept appearing, always in my peripheral vision. My paranoia skyrocketed. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that it was just a weird coincidence, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, as I was walking back to my apartment, I saw it parked at the end of my block, engine running. This time, I couldn't shake the fear. I hurried inside, locking every door and window, trying to calm my racing heart. I debated calling the police, but what could I say? There's a van following me? Without any concrete evidence, I knew they wouldn't take me seriously. From that point on, it was like the van was everywhere. I'd leave my apartment to grab coffee, and it would be parked nearby. I'd go to the gym, and there it would be, on the other side of the street. My anxiety kept building. I started keeping my curtains drawn at all times, locking everything the moment I got home. I even started carrying a kitchen knife with me, just in case. I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the building made my heart jump. I'd stay up, staring out the window, waiting for the van to leave or for something, anything, to happen. One night, while I was taking out the trash, I saw it again. This time, it was parked right outside my building. I couldn't see who was inside, but the windows were completely blacked out. My heart pounded in my chest as I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. I stayed up all night, knife in hand, waiting. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window in the early morning, the van was gone. I thought maybe I could relax. Maybe it was over. But that evening, as I walked home, I saw it again. Parked at the far end of the street, engine idling. I was done. I needed to do something, so I pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture. But the second I raised my phone, the van's headlights flicked on and it roared to life. It drove past me slowly, its blacked out windows hiding whoever was inside. I stood there, frozen, heart racing. I couldn't move until it disappeared around the corner. Shaken, I rushed into my building and locked the door behind me. For hours, I paced around my apartment, expecting to hear that van pull up again. But nothing. The silence was almost worse than the sound of the engine. Just when I was starting to think I'd be okay, I heard it. A soft knock on my door. I froze. My heart pounded in my ears. I crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. The knock came again, louder this time. My stomach churned. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I backed away, clutching the knife tighter. I finally called the police. I reported the van, told them everything. They came by a few hours later, but by then, the van was long gone. They took my statement but didn't seem to believe me. I could tell they thought I was being paranoid. After they left, I sat in my apartment, clutching the knife, every creak and groan of the building making me jump. The tension hasn't gone away. Even now, as I type this, I can hear the faint rumble of an engine outside. I haven't looked. I'm too scared to check, but I know it's there. The van, it's just waiting. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I've never felt more unsafe in my life. I booked an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere for a weekend getaway. My life had been chaotic with work piling up and I just needed a break. I've done this before, solo trips to quiet places where I can relax, maybe read a book or take some long walks. This time, I found a remote cabin that looked perfect, miles away from the nearest town, ideal for some peace and quiet. Everything seemed fine when I arrived, but I noticed a few things that felt off. For one, the house had a faint, musty smell, like someone had been living there. Odd, but I figured it's just the cabin's age. Then there were personal items around, like a toothbrush still sitting in the bathroom and a pair of slippers near the door. It was weird, but I told myself that maybe the host had forgotten to put everything away. I shrugged it off. The fridge, though, really bothered me. It was full: milk, eggs, even some leftovers. That didn't sit right with me, but I rationalized it as the host leaving things behind for convenience. I mean, some people do that, right? I spent the rest of the evening trying to relax. I cooked some dinner, read a little, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling. The house felt too lived in. It wasn't like any Airbnb I'd stayed at before. The bed even felt warm, as if someone had been in it not long before. Still, I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Then, I heard it. Creaking. It came from the ceiling, like someone was walking around upstairs. The sound sent a chill down my spine. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling. Old places creak, right? But it didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. I pulled out my phone and checked the listing again. I hadn't noticed before, but there were a few reviews mentioning that the host sometimes dropped by. That calmed me down a little. Maybe the host had come by and forgotten to tell me? Still, the idea of someone else being in the house without my knowledge made my skin crawl. When I went to bed that night, I was on edge. The footsteps started again, this time louder. They were definitely coming from above. My heart raced, and I froze, listening intently. Was someone upstairs? How could that even be possible? The host hadn't mentioned anyone else being here. Panic gripped me, and I knew I had to check things out. I crept around the house, trying to stay quiet. Every door, every window was locked from the inside, so how could anyone else be here? As I moved, I could hear the footsteps now coming from downstairs. I was too scared to call the police. What if it was just a misunderstanding? Maybe the host had forgotten to block off the dates, and they were here for something innocent. But I didn't want to confront them. Instead, I decided to hide. I crawled into the closet in the bedroom and closed the door. I crouched there in the dark, heart pounding in my chest, barely breathing. I could hear the person downstairs moving around. They were opening doors, maybe searching for something. It sounded like they were going through the kitchen. What would I do if they found me? I felt like I'd been in that closet forever, my body trembling with fear. Then, the footsteps started coming closer. My mind raced. What if they opened the closet door? I gripped my phone but didn't dial. I couldn't think straight. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom. I could hear the person muttering something, frustration in their voice. Double booked. Damn it, forgot to block off the weekend. It hit me. This wasn't some intruder. It was the host. They'd forgotten I was here. The relief I felt was immediate, but it didn't make me feel safe. What kind of person walks into a house without checking if their guest is inside? I stayed quiet, not wanting to reveal myself. The person moved around the room, probably looking for something they'd forgotten. I didn't dare peek out. I kept thinking about how badly this could have gone if they were someone dangerous. Finally, I heard the front door slam, and the house went silent. I waited in that closet for what felt like hours. When I finally crawled out, my legs were shaking. I checked the front door. It was still locked from the inside. The person had left, but the fear hadn't. I grabbed my phone and called the host. I tried to sound casual, asking if they had forgotten to block off the listing for the weekend. The host apologized profusely, explaining that they'd stopped by to grab something they needed and didn't realize I was already there. It made sense, but it didn't make me feel any better. What if they hadn't been the host? What if this situation had gone another way? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and got out of there. I was embarrassed by how scared I'd been, hiding in the closet like a child. But what bothered me more was how easily the whole thing could have turned into a nightmare. Driving away, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't before. I've stayed in Airbnbs alone plenty of times, but this was different. Now every little sound in the night, every creak, will always make me wonder, am I really alone? I live a pretty uneventful life. I work from home, go out for groceries once a week, maybe grab a coffee from the corner cafe if I feel like it. I live alone in a small apartment in the city, nothing fancy. Honestly, I'm just a regular guy trying to make it through the day. But a couple of weeks ago, something happened that I still can't shake. It's been driving me crazy. It started with a package. I wasn't expecting anything. I hadn't ordered anything online recently. But there it was, sitting at my door when I got back from the grocery store. No return address, just my name and apartment number. I figured it was a mistake. Maybe a neighbor's package got mixed up. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside were photos of me, walking down the street, sitting at a cafe, shopping. They were all from different days, different places. At first, I thought it was some weird joke, maybe one of my friends messing with me. But the last photo stopped me cold. It was a picture of me in my apartment, sitting on my couch, taken from outside the window. I tried not to freak out. Maybe someone had a strange sense of humor. I went around checking my windows and door locks, making sure everything was secure. Still, that picture, the one taken from outside my window, stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. A few days passed, and I managed to convince myself it was nothing. Then, another package showed up. This time, the photos were even closer. There were shots of me in my living room, at my desk, even in my bathroom. I swear, one of them was taken while I was brushing my teeth. The angle was so close that whoever took it had to have been right there. My heart raced as I flipped through the photos, and then I saw the last one. It was of me, sleeping. The shot was taken from beside my bed. I tried calling the shipping company. I gave them the tracking number on the box, but they said it didn't exist. That was impossible. The number was printed right there on the label. Frustrated, I contacted the police. They were polite but dismissive, saying there wasn't much they could do unless I had more evidence. A prank, they said. Maybe I should change my locks or get a security camera. It didn't make me feel any safer. I stopped going out as much. Every time I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I started rearranging my furniture, blocking off my windows with curtains and blankets. I even tried sleeping on the couch in the living room, thinking it might make me feel safer. But the packages kept coming. The next one had more photos, closer, more intimate shots. Someone had been inside my home. In one photo, they were standing behind me, clear as day, and I hadn't even noticed. I was terrified, but there was no one I could turn to. My friends thought I was overreacting, and the police didn't take me seriously. I felt so alone, so trapped in my own home. That's when I decided I had to do something drastic. I couldn't live like this anymore. I set up my phone as a security camera, rigged it to record overnight. I was going to catch this person, whoever they were. I barely slept that night, lying on the couch with my eyes half open, listening for any sound, waiting. Around 3 a.m., there was a knock at the door. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the bat I had kept beside me and went to the door, adrenaline rushing through my veins. When I opened it, no one was there. Just another package. I brought it inside, hands shaking, and opened it. This time, there were no photos, just a USB drive. My stomach turned as I plugged it into my laptop. The drive contained videos, dozens of them, all filmed inside my apartment. The earliest ones were from the living room, but the later videos showed me in my most vulnerable moments, sleeping, eating, even showering. Someone had been in my apartment for weeks, watching me without me ever knowing. The last video on the drive was the worst. It showed me sleeping just a few nights ago, but the camera was moving. Whoever filmed it was standing right next to my bed, reaching out as if they were about to touch me. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse racing, and called the police again. But I already knew what they would say. The next morning, I packed up my things and moved out. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to leave. I found a small place in a different part of the city, far from my old apartment, far from the nightmare I had been living in. For the first time in weeks, I felt a tiny bit of relief. Maybe this would be over now. But the fear never left. Even in my new apartment, I found myself checking the windows, listening for strange sounds, watching for any sign that someone might be watching me again. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was safe now. I almost believed it. That is, until today. A package arrived at my door, addressed to me. No return address, just my name and new apartment number. My hands are shaking as I type this. It's the same handwriting as before, the same type of box. I haven't opened it yet. I don't think I want to, but I know deep down that it's not over. Whoever sent those packages knows where I am, and now I'm trapped all over again. The Forgotten Key. I live alone in a quiet part of town. Nothing much ever happens here, and that's how I've always liked it. My days are pretty routine. Work, come home, maybe watch something on TV, then go to bed. It's nothing exciting, but it's comfortable. Or at least it used to be. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. I got home after a long day at work, and the front door was unlocked. It was weird because I always lock it. I chalked it up to a mistake. Maybe I had forgotten. I went inside, checked the place out, and everything seemed normal. No signs of anyone being there, nothing missing. Still, it felt strange. I remember double-checking the door before going to bed that night. I had definitely locked it, and yet, it had been open. The next day, I made sure to lock the door again. This time, I even jiggled the handle a couple of times just to be sure. When I came home that evening, the door was unlocked again. Now I was starting to get freaked out. It wasn't just forgetfulness. I was sure I'd locked it. I walked through the house more slowly this time, checking every room, every corner, but nothing was out of place. My mind raced. Could someone have a key? Maybe a neighbor, a maid, or the previous tenant? I didn't want to believe it, but the feeling that someone had been inside wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. Every time I left, I'd lock the door and check it at least 3 times. And every time I came home, the door was unlocked again. It was like some cruel game. I couldn't figure out how it kept happening. There were no signs of a break-in. I started to question myself. Was I losing it? Stress from work? I even started to feel like I was being watched, like someone was out there, waiting for me to leave and come back. But no matter what I did, the door was always unlocked. Then one night, something small but terrifying happened. I came home, and the door was unlocked, as usual. But when I walked into the living room, I noticed something was off. The book I'd left on the coffee table was slightly moved, just a few inches from where I'd left it. My stomach dropped. Someone had been inside. Someone had touched my things. I decided to install a security camera by the front door. It seemed like the only way to catch whoever was messing with me. The next morning, I set it up and left for work. I spent the whole day feeling anxious, just waiting to come home and see if the camera had caught anything. But when I got home and checked the footage, it was useless. The camera showed me leaving, but then there was a glitch. The feed cut out during the time I was gone, and when it picked back up, the door was unlocked again. My frustration turned into fear. Whoever was doing this knew what they were doing. And worse, they had access to my house, a key, my space. My house didn't feel safe anymore. It didn't feel like mine. I started noticing other small things. A drawer left slightly open, a chair moved just a bit. Little things that wouldn't be obvious to anyone else, but I knew. One night, I came home later than usual. It was after midnight, and the neighborhood was dead silent. As soon as I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. The air inside felt heavy, stale, and there was a faint, unfamiliar smell. I glanced over at the couch and saw a slight indentation, like someone had been sitting there. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. Someone was inside my house, watching me, moving my things while I wasn't there. This wasn't just paranoia. I rushed to find a locksmith, but by that point, it was too late to get anyone to come out. I spent that night sitting in my living room with all the lights on, holding a kitchen knife. Every creak, every small noise made my heart race. I barely blinked. My phone buzzed, and I texted my only friend, explaining everything that had been happening. Their reply was simple: "You're probably just stressed." I knew they wouldn't understand. Hours went by, and the house stayed quiet. Too quiet. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the back door creaking open. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the knife and ran to the back door. But when I got there, nothing. No one. The door was wide open, but there were no signs of anyone coming in or going out. I slammed it shut and locked it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, watching me, waiting. Morning finally came, and I got the locks changed. The locksmith didn't seem to understand my urgency, but I didn't care. I just wanted the nightmare to be over. But even with new locks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The spare key I kept hidden outside? Gone. Whoever was doing this had it. I tried to go back to normal, but every time the house creaked or a shadow shifted, my heart would race. It didn't matter that the locks were changed. I didn't feel safe. Something about the whole situation still felt off, like the danger wasn't over. A few days later, I found the old lock lying in the trash. For a brief moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, like maybe this whole ordeal was finally behind me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the front door creaking open. I didn't move. I didn't check. I just stared at the ceiling, knowing deep down that changing the locks hadn't stopped them. Whoever it was, they had more access to my life than I ever imagined. The watching eyes. I've always thought of myself as a bit paranoid. Living alone for years can do that to you, right? You get used to the quiet, but eventually, the quiet starts to play tricks on you. At least, that's what I told myself when things first started to feel off. It wasn't anything major at first, just small, odd things, like feeling someone staring at me while I walked to my car at night or when I'd sit at my desk at work. I shrugged it off, figured it was just my mind being weird. But now, looking back, I wish I'd trusted that feeling. A few weeks ago, I started noticing a pair of eyes. Not up close, mind you, always from a distance, like from across the street or between two buildings. They never seemed to blink or look away. The first time I noticed, I thought it was nothing, but that uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Probably just some random passerby or a trick of the light, I thought. But after that, it kept happening. Every time I left my apartment, those eyes seemed to be there, watching. One night, I swore I saw them from my bedroom window. But when I rushed over, no one was there. Just empty darkness. Things escalated about a week later. I'd come home late from work, exhausted, when I noticed a car parked a little ways down my street. At first, nothing seemed off, but then I realized the headlights were off, and there was a figure sitting in the driver's seat. They didn't move, didn't get out of the car, they just sat there, watching. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of a person. My heart started to race, but I convinced myself it was just a neighbor, maybe waiting for someone. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd walk to the store, and there'd be someone lingering behind me just a little too long. Or I'd catch a glimpse of a figure out of the corner of my eye, only for them to disappear when I looked directly. The worst part was at home, when I'd see those eyes from my window again, staring up at me from the street. No matter how much I told myself it wasn't real, the fear wouldn't leave. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat. I don't even know why. I wasn't having a nightmare or anything, but something felt wrong. I looked towards my window, and there they were, those eyes, staring in at me. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, but by the time I got there, nothing. Just empty street and shadows. I couldn't sleep after that. How could I? The paranoia was getting worse. At work, I'd feel someone watching me from the office windows across the street. Walking home, I'd change my route, thinking maybe I could shake the feeling, but it never helped. It's like the eyes knew exactly where I was going. Even when I tried to explain it to friends, they just brushed it off. They said I was overreacting, probably just tired, but they weren't the ones seeing those eyes everywhere. It started to affect everything. I barely slept, and when I did, it was shallow, restless. My health was slipping. I couldn't concentrate at work. The final straw came one day while jogging in the park. I was just trying to clear my head when I spotted a man standing by a tree, staring at me. My heart immediately started pounding. I tried to ignore him and kept jogging, but when I looked back, he was still watching. My pace quickened, but so did my panic. I looked back again, and this time, he was gone. Vanished into the crowd, just like that. I knew I wasn't imagining it. A few days later, I saw the same car parked outside my apartment again. This time, I worked up the nerve to walk toward it, hoping to get a closer look. But as soon as I got close, the car sped off, tires screeching. I barely caught a glimpse of the driver before they disappeared. That was when I realized I couldn't take this anymore. A week later, I was walking home after a late shift. The streets were empty, which should have been calming, but it wasn't. I felt it again, that heavy sinking feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard footsteps behind me. They started slow, matching my pace. My heart raced. I sped up. So did they. I broke into a run, adrenaline pumping. The footsteps got louder, closer. I ducked into an alley, hiding behind a dumpster. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but no one came. After what felt like hours, I peeked around the corner. Nothing. Relief flooded through me. But then I saw him. A figure under the streetlight at the end of the block, just standing there, watching. My chest tightened. I couldn't see his face, just the shadowy outline of a person, staring straight at me. I bolted from my apartment, locked the door behind me, and ran to the window. And there, across the street, were the eyes again, staring, unblinking. I couldn't live like this anymore. The next morning, I packed up and left. I moved to a new city, far from that place, hoping I could leave it all behind. For a few weeks, things were normal. I started to feel safe again, but the fear, the trauma, lingered. I told myself I was free, but I never really believed it. On my first day in the new apartment, I was unpacking, trying to settle in. I glanced out the window just to take in my new view. And there, in the building across the street, were the same eyes, staring. No matter where I go, I can't escape them. The eyes are always watching. Word count 1,000. I don't usually take shortcuts when driving, especially late at night. But that night I felt confident. I had just left a friend's party and figured a rural road would get me home faster. I was familiar with the main roads, but this was supposed to save me time. Everything started normal. Empty streets, a bit of music in the background. But the further I drove, the more isolated it became. Houses disappeared, the streetlights became rarer, and the trees on either side seemed to close in, forming a tunnel around me. The radio crackled now and then, and I had to turn it off. It was too quiet. It was around the time I passed the same signpost for the second time that I started feeling uneasy. It was a small, rusty sign I hadn't noticed before, but seeing it again sent a shiver down my spine. Had I somehow circled back? I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, things got worse. My GPS, the one thing I was relying on, started acting up. The map kept spinning, recalculating over and over. I tapped the screen, trying to reset it, but nothing worked. To make matters worse, my phone had no signal. I couldn't call anyone, couldn't check the map. The road became narrower, almost as if the forest was closing in on me. The trees were so thick I could barely see anything past them, and there were no other cars, no houses, no lights, just endless woods. The feeling of dread settled in. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Should I turn back? But where would I go? I hadn't seen a turnoff in miles. Then, up ahead, I saw it. Faint lights in the distance. A gas station. Relief flooded through me. I didn't care how run down it looked. It was my only hope of getting some directions. I pulled in slowly, my headlights barely illuminating the peeling paint and broken windows. There was no one in sight, not even a parked car. The place was dead. Still, I got out of the car. The silence hit me immediately. No wind, no rustling leaves, just complete stillness. I walked up to the door and knocked, but no one answered. The pumps were rusted, covered in grime, and looked like they hadn't been used in years. My anxiety spiked. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I felt trapped, stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to get back. As I was about to turn and head back to my car, I heard footsteps. A man appeared from behind the building. He was older, dressed in a worn-out jacket with a wide smile. "You lost, buddy?" he asked, his voice far too cheerful for the situation. I felt a wave of relief, but something was off. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He pointed down the road. "A lot of folks get turned around here at night. This road can be confusing. Just keep going straight, and you'll find the main road in no time." I nodded, thanked him, and got back in my car. But as I drove off, his smile stayed with me. Something about it wasn't right. Why was he out there, alone, in the middle of the night? My hands were shaking and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. No sign of him. It was as if he had disappeared. I kept driving, but the road stretched ahead endlessly. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming dark, claw-like shapes. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The man's words echoed in my head. This road can be confusing. Confusing? It felt more like a trap. Panic started to set in. What if I had taken the wrong turn again? My eyes darted around looking for anything familiar, but the darkness swallowed everything. I thought about pulling over and trying to figure out a plan, but a new fear gripped me. What if the man was following me? Watching? The fear grew until I could barely breathe. I pushed down harder on the accelerator, trying to get away from whatever was out there. Then, up ahead, I saw it again. The gas station. The same flickering sign. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. How was this possible? I had driven miles, yet somehow I was right back where I started. I couldn't stay there. I had to follow his directions, no matter how wrong they felt. So, I forced myself to drive past the gas station again, trying to stay calm. The road finally began to widen. The trees thinned out, and in the distance, I saw city lights. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I had made it. Somehow, I had gotten back on track. But as I pulled into my driveway later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man's smile haunted me, and the fact that I had ended up back at that gas station was too strange. I locked the doors behind me, but it didn't help the gnawing doubt that had settled in my gut. Weeks later, I still can't forget that night. I keep replaying it in my head, wondering if the man really meant to help or if I narrowly avoided something far worse. My GPS works fine now, but every time I drive at night, I feel like someone's watching me. Sometimes, when I glance in the rearview mirror, I swear I see his smile reflected back at me. The hotel room. I've traveled for work more times than I can count, staying in countless hotels. It's never bothered me. I'm used to navigating unfamiliar places and sleeping in strange rooms, but last month something happened during a work trip that I can't shake off. I was attending a conference in another city, and the company had booked me into this mid-range hotel. It seemed fine when I arrived, nothing fancy, but clean and decent. I checked in late after a long day, just wanting to unpack and sleep. As soon as I stepped into the room, though, I felt uneasy. The air smelled slightly stale, like it hadn't been ventilated in a while, and even with all the lights on, it was dim. I figured I was just tired and brushed it off, but then I heard it, a faint scratching noise behind the walls. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning or maybe old pipes, so I ignored it and unpacked my things. That night, I couldn't sleep. The scratching behind the walls had become louder and more persistent, and now I was hearing footsteps outside my door. Every time I got up to check, no one was there. I kept telling myself it was just other guests moving around, but the inconsistency of the sounds made my skin crawl. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and rustle. The next morning, I went down to the front desk to mention it. The receptionist smiled politely and said, "Oh, the building is old. Sounds travel through the walls." That didn't help. If anything, it made me feel worse. Still, I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. I went to the conference, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering back to the room, and I couldn't shake this weird, paranoid feeling. By the time I got back that evening, the room felt even heavier. I noticed things I hadn't seen before, like how the curtains seemed to shift slightly, even though the windows were closed. Something felt off, like I wasn't alone. When I sat down to check my phone, I saw the hotel Wi-Fi name pop up on the list. Instead of hotel name guest, like you'd expect, the network name was something creepy. You're watched. I froze. I tried telling myself it was some kind of joke, maybe another guest messing around, but it rattled me. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The scratching noises were louder, and the footsteps outside my door seemed more deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. I kept debating whether to call the front desk again, but I knew they'd just tell me the same thing, that I was imagining it, or that it was the building's old plumbing. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and opened the door to check the hallway. Empty. I closed the door and turned back to the room, and that's when I noticed it. The smoke detector in the ceiling. It looked crooked, like it had been tampered with. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and took a closer look. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. There was a small camera hidden inside the smoke detector, staring straight down at the bed. I ripped the camera out and threw it across the room, my hand shaking. What the hell was going on? I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but then stopped. What if I was overreacting? What if they didn't believe me? My mind raced with questions, and that's when I heard it. A faint sound, like someone trying to open my door. The knob jiggled once, twice, then went still. I stood there, frozen. The silence that followed was deafening. Whoever was trying to get in must have known I was inside. I locked the chain on the door and pushed a chair against it, just to feel a little safer. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, eyes glued to the door, my heart racing at every tiny noise. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was done. I packed my things in record time and checked out, not bothering to talk to anyone on my way out. I just wanted to get the hell away from that place. I got in my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Should I call the police? Should I tell someone what I found? In the end, I didn't. I was worried they'd think I was making it up or that I was being paranoid. Later that day, as I was deleting emails from my inbox, I saw a news alert pop up. I opened it out of curiosity, and the headline made my blood run cold. Multiple hidden cameras found in rooms of local hotel. The article detailed how law enforcement had discovered dozens of hidden cameras in smoke detectors, vents, and other places around the hotel. They had been recording guests for months, maybe even longer. I sat there, staring at the screen. Everything I'd felt in that room, the smells, the noises, the off feeling, it all clicked into place. I wasn't imagining things. I'd been watched. The sense of violation was overwhelming. I wanted to go to the police with my story, but I couldn't. I didn't want to relive it, and honestly, I just wanted to distance myself from the whole thing. A few days later, I was still checking every room I stayed in for hidden cameras. I felt like I couldn't trust anywhere or anyone anymore. Every sound, every flicker of movement caught my eye, reminding me of that room. The paranoia has stuck with me, and I'm still not sure how to shake it. Now, every time I stay in a hotel, I wonder, am I really alone? I was 28, working a job that often kept me out late. It was one of those nights, an after-work event that had dragged on too long. By the time I decided to leave, it was close to midnight, and the rain had started coming down hard. I was tired, mentally drained, and just wanted to get home as fast as possible. Public transport was out of the question, so I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare. I've always been careful with rideshares, checking the driver's rating, making sure the license plate matches, sitting in the back seat. But tonight, I was too exhausted to go through my usual routine. The driver showed up quickly, the car exactly as described in the app, and he had a near-perfect rating. Everything seemed fine. I slumped into the back seat, ready for a quiet ride home. But something was off. Maybe it was the way the driver avoided eye contact or how he barely responded when I greeted him. He was polite enough but distant. His face, there was something about it that made me uneasy, but I dismissed it. I figured I was just being paranoid, tired after a long day. The ride started smoothly, and we made small talk for the first few minutes. I mentioned how glad I was to be out of the rain, how exhausting the event had been. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. Then, about 10 minutes in, he took an unexpected turn. I immediately checked the map on my phone. We were going off the usual route. Trying to stay calm, I asked, "Is this a shortcut?" "Yeah, this way's faster at night," he replied, his tone casual. It made sense, I guess. Still, the streets we were on seemed too dark, too empty. No other cars were around, and the rain blurred everything outside. Something didn't feel right. I texted a friend just to let them know about the detour, a precaution more than anything. I didn't expect a reply. It was late, after all. But the growing isolation made me anxious. The driver wasn't talking anymore. His focus on the road had become intense, his face unreadable in the rearview mirror. I started feeling trapped, and in a quiet panic, I reached for the door handle. That's when I realized the child locks were on. I couldn't open the door. A cold shiver went down my spine. Why would the child locks be on? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had kids and just kept them locked out of habit. But the silence in the car was now suffocating. The road we were on got narrower, the lights fewer and farther between. I asked again, my voice shaky this time. Are we almost there? This doesn't look like the usual way. Just avoiding the main roads, he mumbled. His vague answers weren't helping. My heart was racing. I sent my location to my friend again, hoping they'd wake up and notice, but there was still no reply. I checked my phone. No signal. We were in a dead zone. Just as I was trying to decide whether to confront him more directly or wait it out, my phone buzzed. Relief hit me for a split second, until I saw the notification. It was a call from the rideshare company. "Your driver is waiting outside," the voice said when I answered. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. My driver was waiting outside. I wasn't in the right car. The dread I felt in that moment was overwhelming. I was trapped with a stranger, and no one knew where I was. Panic took over. I had to get out. My mind raced. Should I try to break the window, scream, do something to escape? There was nothing useful in the back seat, no way to defend myself. My thoughts were spiraling, and my hands were trembling as I considered my options. I tried to keep my voice calm. "I'm feeling really sick. Can you pull over for a minute?" The driver didn't respond at first. He just glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his face expressionless. For what felt like forever, we drove in silence. Then, finally, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. I reached for the door handle again, praying the locks would disengage. But they didn't. My heart was pounding in my chest as the car came to a complete stop. The driver turned off the engine, and in the sudden quiet, he slowly turned toward me. My mind screamed at me to do something, to act, to get out. But before I could, he reached down and unlocked the doors. He didn't say a word, just gestured for me to leave. My hand shook as I fumbled with the handle, stumbling out into the rain. I stood there, soaked and shivering, watching as he sat in the car for a moment longer before driving off into the darkness. He didn't look back. The headlights disappeared, leaving me alone on the side of a deserted road. My phone buzzed again. This time, my friend had seen the location and called me, panicked. I could barely explain what had happened, my voice shaking too much to make sense of it all. I started walking, unsure of where I was or how long it would take for help to arrive. The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and empty, and the rain kept pouring down. Then I saw headlights in the distance. For a moment, relief flooded me. Someone was coming. But as the car got closer, my heart dropped. It was the same car, the same one I just escaped from. I stood frozen, my friend's voice faint in my ear as the car slowed down again, inching toward me. I wish I'd paid more attention when I got into that car. The locked room. When I first moved into the house, I didn't think much of it. It was an old, worn place, but the rent was cheap, and as a student, that's all I cared about. The landlord was this quiet, older man who gave off a strange vibe, but he seemed harmless enough. He didn't ask many questions and wasn't around much, which suited me just fine. However, there was one thing he mentioned that stuck out. There was a room at the end of the hall that was always locked, and I was never, under any circumstances, to enter it. At first, I shrugged it off. It was probably just for storage or something. I didn't care, as long as I had my space. But then, after a few weeks, I started to notice things. Late at night, I'd hear faint noises from behind that locked door. Soft whispers, the sound of something shifting, like furniture being moved. I figured it was just the house settling, but the more I heard, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old building. These sounds felt deliberate. One night the noises got louder. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was like something or someone was moving around in there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I pushed it aside. It wasn't my business. As weeks passed, the noises didn't stop. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my studies, but it was getting harder. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard it again. This time, a low murmur followed by a loud thud. My heart raced. What was going on in there? I started checking the hallway at night just to make sure the door was still locked. It always was, but the tension was building. I was no longer comfortable in the house. A few days later, I found something strange. Scratch marks on the floor outside the locked room. They were faint but clear enough to make me stop and stare. It looked like someone or something had been clawing at the floor, trying to get out. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. But deep down, I knew something was off. I couldn't stop thinking about the room. Every night, the noises continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but they were always there. I tried bringing it up casually to the landlord one day, asking if there was a reason the room was locked. His response made my skin crawl. He got cold, almost defensive, and quickly changed the subject. The way he shut down the conversation left me more suspicious than ever. That night, the noises were worse than ever. It sounded like someone was walking back and forth inside the room, dragging something heavy across the floor. My fear was turning into obsession. I needed to know what was in there. I couldn't live like this anymore, always on edge, always wondering. I knew it was crazy, but one night, I decided to find out. I had a small lockpicking kit from a phase I went through years ago, and I figured, why not? The landlord was never around and I needed answers. My heart was pounding as I approached the door. The house was dead silent, but my hands were shaking. I could hear nothing from inside, which somehow made it even worse. The lock clicked and I hesitated. Did I really want to do this? But it was too late now. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting something, or someone, to jump out at me. But the room was empty. Well, almost. There was an old dust-covered bed pushed against the wall and a single wooden chair facing the window. The whole room looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. What was I expecting to find? But just as I was about to step inside, I heard it. A whisper. So faint I could barely catch it, but enough to make my blood run cold. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was still empty. I backed out, quickly shutting the door and locking it again. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my mind racing with possibilities. What had I just heard? The next morning, the door was locked again, just as I'd left it. But the whole thing felt surreal, like maybe I'd imagined it. Still, I couldn't shake the fear. The noises had stopped, but now I was even more paranoid. The landlord's strange behavior, the scratches, the whisper, it all added up to something I couldn't explain. That night, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I started packing my things, ready to leave the next day. But just as I was about to zip up my bag, I heard it again. The noises. Only this time, they were louder, more persistent. I stepped into the hallway, and my heart dropped. The door to the locked room was slightly ajar. I grabbed a flashlight and with shaking hands approached the door again. I shone the light inside. The chair. It was facing the doorway now. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, then rushed to my room. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers, the thuds, they didn't stop. Every sound made me jump, and I felt trapped, too scared to leave the house in the dark. By morning, the house was eerily silent. I grabbed my things and left without looking back, not even bothering to say anything to the landlord. As I stepped outside, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the landlord. "Hope you didn't touch the locked room. No one's supposed to go in there." It's been weeks since I moved out, but I still think about that room. Every creak in my new apartment makes me jump, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in there, it's not done with me yet. I never found out what was behind that door, and honestly, I don't think I want to. The office at night. I work for a mid-sized finance company, and staying late has become pretty normal for me. The office is quiet at night, and I get a lot done without distractions. I usually don't think much of it, and honestly, I've come to enjoy it. But last week, something happened that I can't shake off. It was a regular Wednesday, and I was the last one in the building. I had a stack of reports to finish, so I stayed behind to knock them out. It wasn't the first time I worked late, far from it. But that night, from the moment I walked in, something felt off. The silence was different, heavier. I couldn't quite explain it, but it made me a little uneasy. Still, I brushed it off as just me being tired. I sat up at my desk and got to work. After about an hour, I started hearing footsteps from the floor above. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe the cleaning crew had come in early. But then I checked the time. It was past midnight, and I knew they weren't scheduled until morning. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe the building creaking or something. But as the minutes passed, the footsteps didn't go away. If anything, they were getting louder. Curious and a little unnerved, I opened the office security app to see if anyone else was logged in. No one. The entire building was supposed to be empty except for me. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a maintenance worker, or someone had come in without signing in. But the footsteps kept going, and I swear they were following my movements. When I stood up to stretch, they moved too. When I sat down, they stopped. At this point, the dread was building, and I couldn't focus on my work anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed security just to be sure. The guard on the other end told me all floors were empty except mine. There was no one upstairs. That's when the real anxiety kicked in. If no one was up there, then what was I hearing? I tried to push it out of my mind and get back to work, but every few minutes, the footsteps would start again. It wasn't just walking anymore. It sounded deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth directly above me. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Was I just imagining things? Or was someone actually up there? After about another half hour of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight from my drawer and headed for the stairwell. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. It had to be nothing. But every creak of the stairs made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I reached the floor above, it was completely dark. Not a single light was on. I shined my flashlight around the empty desks and cubicles, but everything looked normal. Then I heard it, soft but clear. The sound of a door closing behind me. I froze, my heart in my throat. Someone was definitely here. I turned slowly, shining my light toward the hallway, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadow, just silence. My feet felt glued to the floor, and I could barely breathe. For a second, I considered calling out, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time, and slammed the door to my office shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it. I called security again, my voice barely steady. They checked the cameras again and told me there was no one, no movement, nothing. But I knew what I'd heard. I decided I wasn't staying any longer. I started packing up my things, but the footsteps started again. Only this time, they were right above me. Louder, heavier, like whoever, or whatever, was up there, was following my every move. My mind went into overdrive, panic setting in as I shoved my things into my bag. I kept telling myself it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I rushed to the elevator, my heart pounding in my ears. As the doors opened, the lights flickered, plunging me into darkness for a split second. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But then the lights flickered back on, and the elevator jolted to life. I stepped inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The ride down felt like an eternity, and when the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I practically ran to the security desk. I told the guard everything, my words tumbling out in a nervous rush. He listened, calm, almost amused, as if he'd heard it all before. He checked the footage again and said it was probably just the building settling, maybe old pipes or something. That's when the cleaning crew showed up, running late. They apologized for the delay, explaining that their schedule had changed due to some mix-up. I wanted to feel relieved, and in some ways, I did. But part of me still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I left the building feeling foolish for overreacting, but the unease lingered. As I walked to my car, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in one of the darkened office windows, watching me. I tried to convince myself that it was just paranoia, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But even now, days later, I can't stop thinking about that night. Maybe it was just the cleaning crew all along. Maybe it was my imagination, but I'm not so sure. One thing's for certain, I'm never staying late at the office again. The vanishing roommate. It's been a few months since this happened, and I still can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. I've always been pretty good at brushing off weird stuff, but this has stuck with me in a way I can't explain. It all started when I moved into my dorm at the beginning of the semester. I had just settled into the room with my roommate, Sarah. She was nice, quiet, but friendly enough. We didn't hang out much, but we got along. She had this habit of staying out late, and I didn't think much of it. She'd come back at odd hours, sometimes after midnight, and we'd exchange a few words before crashing. A few days in, I started to notice strange things about her. She'd be on her phone a lot, texting someone, but if I asked her about it, she'd just brush it off like it was nothing. One night, I woke up to hear footsteps in the hallway. Just regular dorm noise, I figured. Except the whispers. They sounded off. Too close. Too deliberate. But again, I told myself it was just someone passing by. College life, right? But everything changed that next morning. Sarah wasn't there. Her bed was neatly made, which was unusual because she wasn't exactly the tidy type. At first, I thought maybe she went to stay at a friend's place or had an early class. But when she didn't come back that night or the next day, I started to get worried. I texted her. No response. Called her, straight to voicemail. By the second day, I was panicking. Sarah had just vanished. I went to the RA, but they shrugged it off, saying maybe she'd gone on a trip or something. It didn't feel right. Later that day, I found a note on my desk. It was written in Sarah's handwriting. It said, "Don't look for me." That's when the fear really set in. I showed the note to the RA, but they dismissed it, saying she might have left it as a joke. But it didn't feel like a joke. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The dorm felt different, darker. I started to notice shadows moving in the hallways, or maybe it was just my paranoia setting in. I convinced myself I was overthinking, but that night, another note appeared. This time, it was worse. "It's safer this way," it said. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I began hearing things at night, footsteps outside my door, whispers that would stop the second I opened it. No one was ever there. I tried asking around, but no one had seen Sarah. Her social media was dead silent. It was like she had vanished off the face of the earth. The police got involved, questioning me like I might know something. I didn't. I was just as lost as they were. Days passed with no sign of her. I couldn't sleep. My nerves were on edge. Then I got a text. It was from Sarah's number. "Don't tell anyone," it said. My heart stopped. I replied, asking where she was, if she was okay. No answer. I started to lose it, checking my phone constantly, waiting for another text. My nights were filled with that same creeping sense of being watched. And then the third note appeared. "You're next." I couldn't breathe. I ran to the door, trying to get out, but it wouldn't budge. It was like someone was holding it from the other side. I banged on it, screamed for help. After what felt like hours, it finally swung open. No one was there. I bolted to campus security, but when I tried to explain what was happening, they looked at me like I was crazy. "It's just stress," they said. "You're imagining things." I went back to my room, and Sarah's side of the room was empty, completely empty. No clothes, no books, no pictures. It was as if she had never been there. I stood there, staring at the blank space where her things used to be. My phone buzzed. Another text. "I'm still here." That was the last straw. I couldn't stay in that room anymore. I packed my stuff that night and moved off campus. But the messages didn't stop. Even after I left, they kept coming. "Too late," one said. Another, "They're coming." I tried blocking the number, but the texts just kept showing up. It was like they were following me. I don't know what happened to Sarah. The police never found anything, and eventually, they stopped looking. But I can't help but feel like whatever happened to her is going to happen to me too. Sometimes I hear things in my new place. Footsteps, whispers. The same ones from the dorm. I check the door at night, make sure it's locked, but I still feel like I'm being watched. Every few weeks, I get another message from Sarah's number. They're always vague, always cryptic. The last one I got said, "Come back, it's not over." I don't know what it means, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I'm never going back to that dorm, but even here, far from campus, I don't think I'll ever be safe again. The silent phone call. I live alone in a quiet neighborhood, which I used to love. As a freelance graphic designer, my routine is pretty predictable. Work during the day, relax in the evening with a show or scroll through social media. It's simple, and I liked it that way. But lately, small things have started bothering me. It's hard to explain, but there are these faint noises outside at night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, maybe animals. But sometimes, it sounds like footsteps. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks after a long day. Then came the first phone call. It was late, around 11 p.m. I glanced at my phone screen and saw unknown number. I figured it was a telemarketer or something, so I let it ring out. The next night, it happened again. Same number, same time. Out of curiosity, I answered, but there was no sound on the other end. Nothing. Not even static. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off as a prank or a wrong number. But the calls didn't stop. Night after night, they came at exactly the same time, with complete silence on the other end. It was starting to get to me. I contacted my phone provider, but they couldn't trace it. They told me the number was unlisted, and there wasn't much they could do. I tried blocking it, but somehow the calls still came through. One night, after hanging up on another silent call, I stood by the window and happened to glance outside. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure standing by the streetlight across from my house. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. They were just standing there, completely still, but it was clear they were holding a phone to their ear. I quickly closed the blinds and tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the person had been watching me. From then on, things got worse. I started feeling like I was being watched all the time. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see someone standing there. I noticed strange things around my house: footprints in the yard, unfamiliar cars driving by slowly, lingering for just a bit too long. My anxiety grew, and I found myself double checking the locks every night, keeping the curtains tightly drawn. Sleep didn't come easily. Nightmares plagued me, dreams where I was being chased or someone was breaking in. During the day, I was constantly on edge, barely able to focus on my work. I tried telling a few friends about it, but they just brushed it off, saying I was overreacting. Even the police didn't take it seriously when I called to report the strange behavior. Without concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. I felt so alone, and my fear only grew stronger. One night, I stayed awake on purpose, waiting for the phone to ring. It came right on schedule, but this time, something was different. As I listened to the silence on the other end, I heard a faint sound, footsteps right outside my window. My blood ran cold. I dropped the phone and ran to the window, pulling back the curtain just a crack, but there was no one there. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Then came the night that changed everything. I answered the phone again, and once more, there was nothing but silence. Frustrated, I slammed the phone down and happened to glance out the window. That's when I saw them. The same figure, standing under the streetlight, phone pressed to their ear, staring directly at my house. I froze. They had been watching me the entire time, playing this twisted game. Panic set in. I ripped the curtains closed and grabbed my phone to call the police. My fingers were trembling as I dialed 911, but before I could hit send, the phone rang again. I answered, my heart racing, but there was only silence. I slammed the phone down and rushed through the house, checking all the locks, making sure everything was secure. Then, I heard it. The doorknob. It jiggled, ever so slightly. Someone was trying to get in. I backed away from the door, eyes wide, holding my breath. The rattling continued for what felt like an eternity, then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, but I knew they were still out there. I debated running out the back door, but I was too afraid to leave. What if they were waiting for me outside? The phone rang again, but this time I didn't answer. I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. I just stood there, clutching a kitchen knife, listening as the footsteps started again, this time circling the house. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they were getting closer. Eventually, the footsteps faded, but I didn't move. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for them to come back. When I finally called the police, they took their time arriving, and by the time they searched the area, the figure was gone. They found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They told me it was probably just a prank, maybe kids messing around. But I knew better. I could feel it in my bones. This was no prank. As I sat there, trying to convince myself it was over, my phone rang again. My heart sank. I stared at the screen, seeing unknown number flash up once more. I hesitated, then answered. On the other end, I didn't hear silence this time. Instead, I heard the sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, like someone walking slowly towards me. I never found out who it was. The calls eventually stopped, but I still can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. Every time I leave the house, I feel eyes on me, though I can never prove it. It's been months, and I still live in constant fear, waiting for that phone to ring again. It was supposed to be just another routine drive. I do long trips a lot, work, family, errands. It's nothing out of the ordinary. This particular trip had me on one of those long, empty highways surrounded by woods where you barely see another car for miles. Honestly, it's usually peaceful. Just me, the road, and my music. But this time felt different. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and I could feel the weight of night creeping in. The road ahead was empty, just the occasional stretch of headlights cutting through the trees, and that eerie stillness you don't notice until you're the only one left driving. I remember thinking it was weird that the highway was so empty. My thoughts wandered, but I was mostly just focused on reaching my destination before it got too late. That's when I heard it. A strange noise from my car. A quick metallic clank, like something under the hood had shifted. My heart jumped for a second, but the sound disappeared, and I figured it was nothing. I turned up the radio, brushed it off, and kept driving. But just as I was settling back into the rhythm of the road, I spotted something that made me pause. A car pulled over on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking in the darkness. At first, I wasn't sure whether I should stop. It's late. I'm alone. And honestly, it's not always smart to pull over for strangers. But something told me to do it. Maybe it was that guilty feeling of leaving someone stranded, or maybe I just thought it wouldn't hurt to help. So, I slowed down and pulled over, leaving my headlights on to illuminate the scene, a decision I'd regret soon after. As I got out, a man emerged from the stranded car. He looked rough, probably in his early 30s, but worn out. His clothes were filthy, as if he'd been stuck there for hours. He didn't even make eye contact as he approached, just mumbled something under his breath about needing help with a flat tire. There was something off about him, though. His words were disjointed, like he wasn't fully there. "Been a long night," he said, not really explaining much else. I hesitated, but I couldn't just drive off at this point. So, I helped him change the tire while he stood there, watching me in complete silence. The whole time, my skin was crawling. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, making me hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. The entire situation dragged on, longer than it should have, with him barely speaking, and me trying to finish as quickly as possible. When we were done, I expected him to thank me or at least say something more normal. But all he did was mutter, "You'll see me again soon," before getting in his car and driving off without another word. The way he said it stuck with me, but I shook it off as him just being weird or exhausted. I got back in my car, eager to get far away from that unsettling interaction. The night had fully settled in by then, and the road was as empty as ever. But it wasn't long before I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another driver on this lonely stretch of highway. But then, the car started getting closer, too close. I glanced in the mirror again, and my stomach dropped. It was the same car I had just helped. The headlights flashed once, then again. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe they just wanted to pass, but they didn't. They stayed right behind me, flashing their lights intermittently, like they were trying to get my attention. Panic crept in. Why was he following me? I sped up, but so did he. I slowed down, hoping he'd overtake me. Nothing. It was like we were playing a game, and I had no idea what the rules were. Minutes passed, and the road became more isolated. No cars in sight, no phone signal, just me and this lunatic tailgating me. I was officially terrified. Every possible scenario ran through my head, none of them good. Finally, up ahead, I saw the glowing sign of a gas station. I had no other option, so I pulled in, hoping the guy would just drive past. But instead, he pulled in right behind me, blocking any easy exit. My heart raced as I parked and quickly made my way inside, trying to stay calm. The gas station was quiet, almost too quiet. The only other person inside was a clerk, sitting behind the counter, glued to their phone. I grabbed a drink from the cooler, my hands trembling as I tried to act casual. But when I glanced outside, I saw him, just sitting in his car, staring directly at me. He didn't move, didn't get out, just sat there, watching. I fumbled with my phone, praying for a signal, but there was nothing. The fear was overwhelming, but I couldn't let him see how scared I was. After paying, I made my way to the door, my eyes locked on the man's car. That's when I saw it. His door slowly opened, and I froze. Was he coming inside? Was he armed? I couldn't move, my feet stuck to the floor, but then, instead of walking toward the gas station, he turned and headed toward the restroom behind the building. I took my chance. The moment he was out of sight, I bolted for my car. I started the engine and sped out of the lot without looking back. Relief flooded me as the gas station disappeared behind me. But that feeling didn't last long. I checked my mirror, hoping to see an empty road, but instead, I saw the headlights again. They were getting closer. I hit the gas, my heart pounding in my chest, but no matter how fast I went, those lights kept closing in. I've always been the type of person who takes the subway late at night. My job often keeps me working late, so it's become part of my routine. It's never really bothered me before, just a quiet train ride home, maybe a book or some music to pass the time. But last night felt different, and now I can't stop thinking about it. The platform was unusually empty when I arrived. Normally, even late at night, there are a few other stragglers. But last night, it was just me, standing under the flickering lights, waiting for the last train. The silence felt heavier than usual, but I brushed it off. It had been a long day, and I told myself I was just tired. When the train finally pulled up, I stepped inside and immediately noticed the car was completely empty. Again, it wasn't unheard of at this hour, but it felt off. The doors closed, and the train started moving, and that's when I realized just how alone I was. There wasn't a single other person in sight. The silence in the car was deafening. I tried to relax, scrolling through my phone to distract myself, but then I heard it. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. There was a sound coming from the back of the car. At first, it was like a whisper or maybe a shuffle. I looked over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I told myself it was just the train settling, the wheels against the tracks, something normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I moved to a seat closer to the door, thinking maybe I was being paranoid. But the sound continued, and now it was louder, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart started racing, and I turned around again, more sharply this time. There was still no one there, but I knew someone was behind me. I could feel it. At this point, I started debating whether to move to another car or pull the emergency brake, but both felt extreme. What if it really was nothing? I didn't want to look foolish, overreacting to a noise that could easily be explained. So I stayed put, trying to calm myself. The train rattled through the tunnel, and the lights flickered, just for a second. But in that moment, I saw something. A shadow. It wasn't clear, just a vague shape in the reflection of the window, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. When the light stabilized, there was nothing behind me again. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, that the flickering lights were playing tricks on my eyes, but my gut told me otherwise. The footsteps came again, closer this time. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking, but I stood up, determined to face whatever was making that noise. Slowly, I made my way to the back of the car. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air around me was getting thicker. When I reached the end of the car, I hesitated before opening the emergency door that led to the area between the train cars. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. What if someone was hiding there, waiting for me to come closer? But I had to know. I pulled the door open just a crack and peered inside. There, crouching next to some maintenance equipment, was a man in an orange vest. He stood up quickly, startled by my sudden appearance. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice calm. "I'm just doing some maintenance on the car." Relief washed over me so fast I felt dizzy. Of course, that explained everything. He must have been making the noises I'd been hearing. I apologized awkwardly, feeling a little embarrassed that I'd let my imagination run wild. But as I turned to head back to my seat, something about the way he was watching me didn't sit right. His expression was neutral, maybe even friendly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind it. I quickly thanked him and went back to my seat, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. When the train pulled into my station, I was more than ready to get off. I stepped onto the platform, the cool air hitting my face, and for a moment, I felt relief. The station was as empty as before, but at least I wasn't in that subway car anymore. I told myself it was just a weird late-night encounter, and that there was nothing to worry about. But as I walked toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced back at the train just as the doors were closing. In the reflection of the window, I saw it again. This time, I was certain there was someone else standing in the car, right where I had been sitting. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty train as it pulled away. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It couldn't have been the maintenance worker. I'd just seen him leave the car through the back. But who else could have been there? I left the station, my heart still pounding in my chest. Even now, as I write this, I can't stop thinking about it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But part of me knows something wasn't right. I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, or the shadow in the reflection. I haven't taken the subway since. The unwelcome visitor. I moved out here to get away from it all. You know how it is. City life can get to you after a while. I needed space, quiet, and a chance to clear my head. So, I bought this small cabin out in the middle of nowhere. There's something peaceful about being surrounded by trees, with nothing but nature around you. For the most part, it was exactly what I needed. Days were spent hiking, chopping wood, and working from home. At night, I'd sit by the fire with a book. Occasionally, I'd hear noises, branches snapping, the wind rustling through the trees, but I figured it was just animals. Living in the woods, you get used to those sounds, right? But some of them didn't feel right. There was a weight to those sounds that made the back of my neck prickle. One morning, after a light snowfall, I noticed something strange. Footprints leading up to my window. They weren't mine, and they weren't animal tracks. These were human. They stopped right at the window, and then they turned back toward the forest. I stood there, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a hunter, I thought. People pass through sometimes, don't they? Still, it unsettled me. A few days passed, and I couldn't shake that feeling. I started paying more attention, looking for signs. It wasn't long before I found them. Broken branches near the house, cigarette butts that weren't mine, and slight disturbances in the snow around my windows. Every night I locked the doors and double-checked the windows, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I asked my nearest neighbor, who lives about half a mile away, about it. He brushed it off. "Probably just hunters or someone passing through," he said. "Happens more often than you think." That didn't sit well with me, but I nodded and tried to move on. Then, one night, I heard it. Footsteps on my porch. Slow and deliberate. I shot out of bed and ran to the door, yanking it open, but there was no one there. Just the sound of retreating steps in the snow, fading into the darkness. I stood there, heart racing, feeling more vulnerable than ever. The next few nights were worse. Every little noise sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I was on edge constantly, jumping at the creak of the floor or the rustle of leaves outside. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of tapping, light, rhythmic, like someone was knocking on my window. My blood turned cold. I couldn't move. I just lay there, listening, heart pounding in my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to check, there was no one there. But in the morning, I found more footprints, right under my bedroom window. That was it for me. I called the police. They came out, did a quick search of the area, and found nothing. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a prank. Kids messing around, maybe. But I knew better. Someone was watching me. After that, sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed, listening, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that whoever it was had come back. The peace I had come here for had been replaced by a creeping, constant dread. I started locking myself in, keeping the lights off, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'd stop. Then one morning, I found a piece of cloth snagged on a branch near my window. It was torn, like someone had brushed against it. That was the final proof I needed. Someone had been right there, inches from where I slept. My chest tightened with fear, and I couldn't think straight anymore. The breaking point came a few nights later. I woke up in the dead of night, the room lit only by the faint moonlight. That's when I saw it. A figure standing outside my window, just watching. They didn't move. They didn't say anything. They just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't breathe. My body froze, heart hammering in my ears. I don't know how long they stood there, but it felt like forever. Eventually, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods. I snapped out of it and called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. The police searched the area again and found nothing, just disturbed snow where the figure had been standing. They told me to call them if it happened again, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe me. To them, it was just another call from a paranoid guy living in the woods. After they left, I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something, anything. I felt trapped in my own home, unable to relax. The quiet that I had once loved now felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. The night dragged on, every little creak making my heart race. But nothing happened. I stayed up until dawn, watching, waiting. When the sun finally rose, I felt a small sense of relief until I saw it. Another set of footprints, fresh in the snow, leading away from the house. Whoever it was had come back while I sat there, completely unaware. That was a few days ago. I haven't seen the figure since, but I can't shake the feeling that they'll be back. Every night, I sit by the window, watching the tree line, waiting for that figure to appear again. I don't know what they want, and I don't know what I'll do if they come back. But I do know one thing. They're still out there, and they're not done with me yet. I used to take the late-night train home from my part-time job in the city. It was a long ride back to the small town where I lived with my parents, but I gotten used to it. The station was almost always empty at night, and sometimes there'd be a few stragglers, other late workers or travelers, but it was mostly just me, waiting in the cold under the flickering lights. My parents used to warn me about traveling alone at night, but I didn't think much of it. It was part of my routine. Lately, though, I had this strange feeling, like I was being watched. I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, or feel someone's gaze on me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I told myself I was just tired, that it was all in my head. That night started the same as usual. I grabbed a seat on the empty bench, glancing at my phone, waiting for the train. Then I saw him. He was sitting across from me on the opposite bench, an older man, maybe in his 50s. His clothes were outdated. He wore this old, thick coat that didn't fit the season. He wasn't homeless, but something about him seemed off. He didn't break eye contact. His stare was cold, unblinking, and it made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on my phone, but my hands were shaking. There were 10 minutes until the train arrived. 10 long, agonizing minutes. The platform was deserted, and the sounds of the city seemed far away. It was just me and him. I thought about leaving the station and coming back later, but I'd already been waiting a while, and the train would be here soon. I glanced back up at him, and he stood. Calmly, he walked toward me, his expression blank. I froze. He stopped a few feet away and, in a quiet, unsettling voice, asked for directions to a place I'd never heard of. His voice was too polite, too calm for this late hour. I mumbled something incoherent, not sure what to say, just wanting him to go away. Without saying another word, he turned and walked back to his bench. I thought that was it, that he'd leave me alone. But no, he sat down again, still staring. This time, though, there was a faint smile on his face. My heart was pounding. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and moved farther down the platform, closer to the edge, hoping that would be enough to make him stop. He didn't follow me, but I could still feel his eyes on me. The train was still 5 minutes away, and it felt like an eternity. Every glance I threw his way showed the same thing. He was still staring, still smiling. When the train finally arrived, I rushed on board and found a seat in the middle of the car. I looked out the window, praying I wouldn't see him. But as the door started to close, I saw him step onto the last car. My stomach dropped. He was on the train with me. I started to panic. Did he follow me on purpose? Was this just a coincidence? I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that he probably wasn't thinking about me at all, but I couldn't shake the fear. Changing cars seemed like a solution, but the idea of walking through the empty train, especially with him somewhere behind me, made my legs feel weak. I tried to focus on the upcoming stops. I would get off at the next one, no matter where it was. I couldn't stay on the same train as him. My phone had no signal, and I hadn't seen anyone else in my car. I felt alone and trapped. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps coming from the back of the train. My heart started racing again, my breath caught in my throat. Every step felt deliberate, calculated, like he was taking his time. I told myself to stay calm, to breathe, but my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, listening to those steps getting closer. The footsteps stopped. For a second, I thought maybe he had turned back, that he wasn't coming for me. But then I heard the door creak open. He was moving between the cars, getting closer. I couldn't wait any longer. The next stop was minutes away, and I had to get off the train. My eyes stayed glued to the door, counting down the seconds until the train would slow down. Every second felt like a lifetime. I imagined him stepping into my car, moving toward me. Finally, the train began to slow. As soon as the doors opened, I ran out. I didn't look back, didn't care where I was. I just needed to be off that train. My chest was tight, and I could barely breathe as I stepped onto the platform. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I looked around. The platform was empty. No taxis, no open shops, just darkness. I was alone again, but this time there was no train to escape to. And then, I heard them. The footsteps. He had followed me off the train. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My legs were weak, and I felt like I might collapse, but I forced myself to walk forward, trying to act casual. The footsteps matched my pace, slow and unhurried, always a few steps behind me. My pulse was racing, and my mind was screaming for me to run, but I knew it was too late. I'm writing this from my room, safe, for now. I never saw him again, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next time I'm alone.